My Kestrel spent 2 days loose, and in this video I'm going to show you why it happened and how to prevent it from happening to you. This is Argo, and here's my male Eurasian Kestrel. We can tell he's a male because he's got this beautiful blue-grey colour on his head and his tail. Now Argo's tail is a bit strange at the moment because he's in the middle of molting. Typically when a bird molts, they will molt one feather at a time. That means whilst that feather is growing, it's supported by a feather on each side. However, Argo decided to molt out 9 out of 12 of his tail feathers all in one go, so they're now all growing at the same time. What's also strange about Argo is that a male Kestrel's tail is this beautiful blue-grey colour for most of the way down, and then it's got a single black stripe along the bottom and then a white tip. But Argo's new feathers that are growing through have got several black stripes all the way down them. And that's really strange, I've never seen that before. This is my set of scales. Before every flying session, the bird is weighed. Falconry is based all around weight management. Birds of prey will only ever fly for food. So if they're not interested in eating, then they're not interested in you. Every bird has a specific flying weight, and a flying weight is the weight that that bird is flying best at that time. Now I say at that time because a flying weight can and should change. It's not set in stone. Over Christmas and New Year, all of the birds had a bit of a break. So on Monday, new week, new year, I came and weighed Argo, ready to take him out and fly him. So once I had prepared food, weighed Argo, attached his telemetry, I brought him out and we started doing some training. We weren't doing anything spectacular to start off the year. I just wanted him flying between a couple of perches or from a perch to my glove, just to bring him back into the things. Argo had done really well with what I wanted him to do. He'd done lots of different flights, he had a good reaction time, and so I had 2 pieces of food left. He was on a perch far away from me. All I wanted him to do was fly to the perch next to me and then go from the perch to my glove. So by this point he'd had almost an entire chick, almost his full rations for that day. So last flight I flew him over to the last perch and gave him a piece of food, and then just before I could get him to jump back to my glove, a buzzard flew over the top with a few crows, and this completely spooked Argo. He jumped straight up into the air and started flying around, so as quickly as I could, I got a full chick out of my bag and put it on my glove to try and call him back down, but he was just too freaked out, and he started to gain height, and as he gained height, he started to get pushed around by the wind. And that's when things got a lot worse. He got pushed over several fields away from me and then landed in somebody's garden.
At this point, he'd gone completely out of sight. And this is why it's so important to put telemetry on your free-flying birds. Argo was wearing this, a microtransmitter. It only weighs a few grams, and despite having such a tiny battery, should give off a signal for 100 hours. To track it, I used this, a receiver. I did make a full video about tracking a bird of prey, so I won't go into too much detail. But in short, it becomes a big game of hot and cold. You get a louder beep when you are facing the bird, and it also gets louder the closer you get to the bird. With Argo being such a small bird, and the fact that he doesn't wear a bell, being able to track him with telemetry was vital. I know he'd gone into a neighbour's garden that borders the flying field, but I hadn't seen which one. So I basically had to run down the street pointing my receiver at everyone's house, listening out for the loudest beep. When the signal went quiet again, I knew I'd gone too far, so I turned around and I went and knocked on the door of the house that had the loudest beep coming from it. I explained what had happened and asked if I could look in their garden. They let me in, but I couldn't see him. And this is the difficulty with radio telemetry around buildings and trees. The signal bounces. I was getting a signal in every single direction that I looked, and that's really not very helpful when looking for a small bird. Very kindly, my neighbour let me climb up onto their garage roof, giving me a bit of height over everybody's garden, and this instantly made such a difference. I scanned the area and spotted him on another roof. I got a full chick out and whistled, calling him to my glove. He took one look at me and flew off in the opposite direction. And this is when I really started to realise that this was going to take a while. As he'd flown for a lot of his food already, he wasn't interested in what I was offering. I also have a feeling that because I was stood next to him when he was spooked by the wild birds, he was starting to associate me with that situation and had become scared of me too. For the next 4 hours, I chased him from roof to roof, waving large bits of food, and he was just not interested. And then about 4 hours after he had been spooked, he landed on a low roof in a stable yard next to the flying grounds. I managed to get within a few meters of him and again showed him a very large piece of food. He looked and bobbed his head, and that's a really good sign. He wanted the food, but then again, he took off and flew away from me.
I chased him around this field, and that one over there. I chased him around these fields, I chased him around this field, and I chased him around this one. He was on this roof, these roofs, and this roof. And that's when he came over to this set of woods here, and I found him in these tall trees right behind me. Now, up until this point, he'd just been flying around the village in really close proximity to the flying field. And whilst this is still quite close to the flying field, it is the furthest away he'd been yet. And it was looking like he was going further and further away. And I didn't want that to happen. I wanted to keep him nice and close. The sun was starting to go down, and I had to try a new technique. Now, this different technique takes advantage of the fact that he is a predatory animal. Birds of prey don't let go of their food. So as he's trained to fly to tea perches, I had brought one of those with me. I stuck it in the ground and I tied a chick to the top of it with a spare leash, in the hopes that he would fly down to it and grab onto the food and tried to take off with it, but couldn't because it was tied to it. Whilst he was then stood on it, not letting go because he doesn't want to let go of his food, I could then sneak up on him and grab it. But Argo had other ideas. Whilst he did look at the food and he bobbed his head again, which is a sign that he does want the food, he turned around and flew off. And this was now the furthest that he'd actually been. But with the sun going down, it was obvious that he wasn't hungry enough to come back to me. I decided I had to leave him out overnight. Now, with him showing such little interest in the food, and with the sun now going down, knowing there would be no way we'd be able to see him or hear him because he wouldn't wear a bell, I had to leave him out overnight. And this was incredibly nerve-wracking for a bunch of different reasons. One reason being the fact that he's not a wild bird. He was bred in captivity, he spent his entire life in captivity, he has always had the safety of an aviary to live in, and he's been trained to fly for his food, so he's never had to hunt and catch his own food. He's never had to try and survive in the wild by himself. And so it made me really nervous knowing that I had to leave him out overnight.
If you are enjoying this video, then please leave a like. Just a simple act of that like button tells YouTube that this is a channel worth showing to other people, so it really helps out.
The other reason it was so nerve-wracking leaving him out overnight was to do with the telemetry's battery life. Now, Marshall, who makes the telemetry, say that their microtransmitter can send a signal for up to 100 hours with a fresh new battery. And for the first 30 hours of that, it works completely normally, giving off a series of radio beeps. After you've hit that 30-hour mark, every 10th beep, it does a double signal. Now, when I first put the telemetry on Argo, I only listened for a couple of beeps just to check that it was actually on. So I actually didn't know how much battery life was left in the telemetry. When Argo had flown off and I started to track him, I realised it was giving me double signals, which means 30 hours had already been used up, but I didn't know how much longer the battery life had. So I had to leave him out overnight, and I just had to hope and pray that when I got up in the morning, there was still a signal. And there was. The next day, I got up at first light, and I drove straight over to the woods that I left him. This is where the signal was still coming from, but once I'd got into the woods, I had quite a bit of difficulty. The signal again was bouncing all over the place because I was surrounded by trees. But I did manage to get myself into a bit of a clearing, and then found the direction that the signal was coming from. It turns out he'd gone even further overnight, which I wasn't expecting. Usually birds, especially diurnal species like the kestrel, will find a place to roost and they'll sit overnight and not move. So something must have spooked him, or the wind had blown him and he'd had to pick up and move further away. And while this is the furthest that he'd been, it was still only 1 mile from the original flying field. To begin with, I tried calling him just to the glove. I thought maybe because he's been out overnight and all the flying from the day before, he'd be really hungry and he might just come straight back to me. So once I found where he was, I got a full check out, showed it on the glove and whistled. But he turned around and flew off again, and I thought, great, we're just going to go through all of this again today. so I didn't mess about with that any longer, and I thought I'll try a different technique. I got the crayons, the training line out, and I tied a fresh chick to the end of it. And then I basically used it as a lure, and I swung it around, I crept underneath him, and then I chucked it out on the floor. And so it was a long line with a chick on the floor attached to the training line, with the idea that, same as the perch, he would come down, grab the food, and as he wouldn't want to let go of the food, I would be able to creep in and grab hold of him. Now this did pique his interest. I tried it a few times and he really was bobbing his head and looking at me, and a few times he did take off and come and swoop at it, but he wouldn't commit to actually grabbing it. And then he had a fight with a wild kestrel. I have no idea where this wild kestrel came from. She wasn't there before, she was a much larger female than him, and it must have been her territory. And so I was chasing him around and they collided in the air, and there was a lot of shouting, and then as I got closer, she got spooked by me and she flew off. But Argo was even more spooked than before, and now he really didn't want to come back to me. So I decided I was going to have to leave him out even longer to really help him build up an appetite to want to come back. Now once I had sorted out all the other birds, I decided to go out and try a third time. I went into the garden and looked for a signal, and it was pointing me the same direction as when he had a fight with that wild kestrel and I left him. So I got in the truck and I drove straight over there. Once I got there, I got back out and scanned around again, and the signal was sending me back where I came from, so he must have come a bit closer. I got back in the truck and I tracked him to an open field with two large pylons. When I got there, I thought by now surely he must be absolutely starving. And so I tried again, just calling him to the glove for a large chick, but nothing. I then tried lots of different techniques to bring him back. I tried swinging the crayons with a chick on the end like a lure again and chucking it on the floor. I tried tying food to a post, which he very almost went for at one point. And I tried dropping a chick on the floor tied to the crayons and running away and hiding. And then I decided, I've got my lure with me, why not try that? Now Argo has never been a lure-bound bird. He's never been trained to the lure. Falcons don't just naturally chase the lure, they have to be trained to it. And this is not something Argo has ever done. So I was really surprised that as soon as I got out and started swinging it, he instantly turned around, looked at me and started bobbing his head, as if he recognised what it was. So I continued swinging the lure, and 3 times he took off and flew at me, but he just wouldn't commit to grabbing it with his feet. I would go back and land on the pylon again. So attempt number 4, I decided I'll swing the lure to get his attention, and as soon as he takes off, I'm going to throw it in front of me onto the floor. And so I did that, I swung the lure, he took off, and I threw it and it dropped on the floor in front of me, and he stooped all the way down and grabbed it on the ground. Now he had connected with his food, I knew it's unlikely that he would let go, but this is the closest I'd been to him, so I had to be really careful at this point. Now there is a technique that you can use, which I have used in the past, where a bird is on the lure and you use the lure line and walk around in circles around the bird and basically wrap up their legs, getting closer and closer as it wraps around their legs. Not tight enough to cause them any damage, but if they do try to take off and let go of the food, then they are tangled up and you can go in and pick them up. I really wanted to do this with Argo, but I couldn't. He had landed in a place that was too tight for me to walk around in a full circle. He was right between the pylon and the fence. So I just had to really slowly creep my way in, but he kept looking at me. So instead, I started to just pull the lure line towards me. So there was Argo, terrified of me, but not letting go of his food, surfing along the grass, getting closer and closer, and then at one point I tugged it a little bit too hard and he let go of it. I thought, no, this has gone on for too long, I can't have it all end now and have him fly off again. So I just wiggled the lure line so that the chick on the end wiggled a little bit. He looked at it and he must have been hungry, because straight away he pounced right back on it again. And so I kept slowly pulling him towards me. There he was, surfing along the grass, until he was a couple of meters away from me, where I laid down, creeped up really slowly towards him whilst he was looking right at me, and then I grabbed his legs, and finally I'd got hold of him.
The first thing I did when I got him back was give him a good check over. I know from how well he had been flying that he was probably fine, but he did have a scrap with a wild kestrel and he spent the entire night out when I couldn't see what he was up to, so it was important to check for any injuries. Apart from a couple small scratches on some toes, he was absolutely fine. When we got home, I gave his feet a clean and put on some of this F10 germicidal barrier ointment. And then I weighed him. His weight when I took him out to fly was 195 grams, and one full chick tends to keep his weight steady and consistent. So with that, plus the huge amount of flying he had done, and the night he spent out of the safety of his aviary at 1 degree with strong winds, means that his drate should have dropped considerably. But when I weighed him, he was only 193 grams. A drop of only 2 grams, so either he had had something to eat whilst being out and about, or my scales were wrong. And here lies the issue with modern scales, the batteries. I had spent Christmas in York with my family, and I had left my scales in the weighing room the entire time, and over New Year, and it gets very cold in the weighing room. It's basically just a shed with electricity. And batteries don't like to work in the cold. The batteries had got so cold that the scales were just all over the place. They wouldn't hold on zero when nothing was on them. I think they gave me a false reading when I weighed Argo at 195 grams. I suspect he was much heavier than this, and that means he was already overweight when I took him out to fly. Add a full daily ration on top of that, and then spook the bird, and that's a recipe for a bird that's not going to come back for a while. So if you take anything away from this video, it should be the importance of good weight management of your hawks, and that digital scales can't always be trusted. Now I have a totally new set of scales that lives in the house and are taken up to the weighing room with me just when the birds have been weighed, so they can't be left out to get really cold and faulty. If you've enjoyed this video, then leave a like and comment. It would be interesting to hear from those who have their own birds, what the longest time you've had a bird out for, and how did you get them back. Make sure to subscribe for more bird of prey related content, and as always, thank you for watching.